Okay, so let me do announcement of public meeting, and then we'll ease on into the agenda. Busy signal. Good afternoon, everybody. Notice of the time and place of this board workshop was publicized by notifying the area news media, by updating the OPPD website, and by emailing such notice to each of the district's directors on August 21st, 2020. Thank you all for joining us remotely via WebEx events. As a reminder to board members, senior management, and OPPD staff, please mute your microphones to reduce background noise. To any members of the public, thank you for attending, or if you're watching this later, thank you for viewing it later. Those attending now, you are in listen-only mode. If you have any technology questions, please use the chat feature in WebEx to communicate with the event host. We will not be taking public comments during the workshop, but if you would like to send us comments, please do, and use the board contact form on the OPPD website, which is at oppd.com/directorscomment. That's oppd.com/directorscomment, and we absolutely would love to see those, and we'll of course receive those and incorporate those into our thoughts as we move forward. Today's workshop will be facilitated by Eric Douglas and Bill Slayton of Leading Resources, Inc. Eric and Bill both have significant experience in helping boards with performance and governance. Our agenda today, I believe, is being shown. There's Bill Slayton's. There we go. So there's our agenda. I'm not going to read it to everyone, but this is something that we've been over at least more than a few times to make sure that it's tight and we're achieving exactly what we want to. We'll do some introductions to begin. So a board governance overview, and then discussion of key policy principles and recommendations. So for those visitors, we've had definitely some pre-work that the board has participated in. So today is in many ways sort of the culmination of a lot of work that we've already put in, leading us to today, and that will manifest itself throughout the course of today and tomorrow. After a break, we'll talk about what our process is for refining board policies. In many cases, it's my view that that's mostly an affirmation of what our processes are, and then a discussion of next steps. So tomorrow is really when we get into the results of the board survey around the policies, board linkages, and GPs that we have, and start to really get into which of those we want to start to tackle for potential refinement in the coming 12-month period. Okay, so that's our agenda. If Mr. Burke is on, I would love to have a safety briefing, and if he's not on, I would ask a member of senior management to step in and assist for our safety briefing today.
So Mr. Burke is on.
There he is.
But I've lost visual contact, so but I have audio contact. So I have no idea what Ms. Hinders has up on the screen, but I would say we've historically talked about the 10 steps to prevent COVID-19, as well as, and certainly most importantly, wearing a mask, and certainly in our office environments or home environments, we may not necessarily need to do that. But with the severe heat, just a reminder also, if Gatorade is not a replacement for water. Matter of fact, you should have 4 glasses of water for every glass of Gatorade. And so when you're out in the outdoors and you may be working or even having fun and doing those kinds of things, remember that to stay hydrated, use sunscreen, and look around the area where you are for any tripping hazards, and make sure you're knowledgeable of them before you begin to move around. So that concludes my safety briefing.
All right, well done, Tim. Thank you, sir. Okay, I think that wraps up the preamble before we get into the agenda. So we are on to introduction. Eric, Bill, did you want to tee any of this up, or are you ready for me and Tim to just kind of run with it?
You're muted, Eric.
Craig, why don't you just go ahead and
Okay.
roll with it?
Sounds good. Well, we've shared the agenda, and I'll leave the ground rules for someone else to cover. But I think maybe the only thing that I really want to offer today is a couple things. One is first, some appreciation for the work that's already gone in to get us to this point. As I mentioned earlier, today is in many ways sort of the culmination of a lot of work that happened leading up to today. And that's no small feat in terms of getting it scheduled with a busy group of people, but also the work that was put in on the part of Ms. Henners, Scott Foch, senior management team, and you, my board colleagues, to give some thoughtful deliberation to some of the questions that have been posed to us about kind of where we're going and some of the policies, BLs, and GPs that we want to think about. So thank you for spending the time. I know that everybody is extraordinarily busy. We talked about this at our last board meeting, how busy the organization is, and I think that's true for board members as well. We're sort of feeling this is a busy month between board meetings, having to be present for the first time in August, and now being on a 6-hour workshop. So thank you for taking the time. I think it's a clear demonstration that we as board members are really committed to the success of the organization, and I appreciate our ability and willingness to step forward and really do that. The last thing that I would say is let's agree that we're going to work towards and work collaboratively towards continuing to co-create the kind of utility that we want to be really proud of. This workshop is but a step in that process, and I think, and I'm hopeful that we're going to walk out of this tomorrow with some clear pathways forward for, again, continued improvement. I think that's a key component of this. But to the extent that we can all kind of lean forward and say, let's work together, let's figure this out, let's have good, productive conversations, let's lean on some of the the bias training and red teaming that we've learned about recently and really incorporate a lot of that into our discussion. I think we're going to be in a much better position on the back end. Last thing that I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is every time I get asked about what it's like to be on the OPPD board, one of the first things that I talk about is how proud I am and how impressed I am with the way in which the board members show up, leave the junk outside of the room and really come to these conversations, staying focused on what's in the best interest of the utility. And that to me is really key to every conversation that we have, and it makes it a joy and a treat to work with all of you, and I'm looking forward to more of that over the next 6 hours. So with that, I'll be quiet for a while and let either Eric run or Tim, if you've got any opening comments that you'd like to offer, I'd welcome those now.
Yeah, I do. Thank you very much, Craig. Greatly appreciate it. And Bill and Eric, thanks for being here. And hopefully I'll be visual very shortly here. So so this will be a little interesting, but I'd love to be able to see you as I'm doing this. But just a couple points from me. I really truly appreciate both the board and the senior management, commitment to really think about continually improving the way that we think about governance, we think about the practices through these workshops, and if anything has kind of just assured me is that we have the ability to continually improve, and I appreciate that. Appreciate the board's commitment in doing that. I know that the board and the senior management team over the last several months have really been focused on the importance of building cohesive and trust between us. And I think that's very important. We should not lose sight of that in this work very clearly. We can, if we can focus on a shared commitment to strengthen cohesion and trust, then these next 2 days could be just incredibly valuable to OPPD and how we and our employees can best serve our district customers, owners. As I was thinking about this in this kind of opening introduction, an important question that I continually ponder is there shared perspective in the opportunities and challenge to governance, to board linkages, and to strategic direction? I think that's really important. So from a senior team perspective, we want to be just incredibly helpful. We want to be leaders in the work that we do. We also want to be very supportive of the board's perspective and the board's vision. And as we reflect on the work that may surface over the next 2 days, I think it's really important, or at least an important question for us would be, is it helpful to both the board and the senior management in the service to OPPD's customer owners? And I think that's really important for us to think about. And then the other item I want to leave, which may be a topic over the next day or two here, is really when we're exercising unity of control. I think when the board provides clear direction, then management is able to plan and align the resources of the district in support of that direction. But without that unity of control, it sometimes has felt to us that there may not be a clear voice providing direction to the district. And I think it's really important that that occurs. And when that doesn't occur, it can be somewhat discouraging to us as we are trying to handle all kind of individual board of directors kind of individual needs. So unity to control is very important from a senior management perspective. So I would ask us to think about that, because when we don't use that unity of control from a board perspective, it truly can be damaging, it can be demotivating, it can be disengaging to the whole organization and certainly the senior team. So I hope we will have a conversation and that will continually focus on our capability as a senior management and a governance board to really focus on that unity of control, and that'll give us great direction for the future. So that's my introduction as we kind of lead into our conversation over the next 2 days. So thank you.
So, and this is Eric Douglas. Let me just build a little bit on what both Craig and Tim said, and just again, thank you for the privilege of being able to work with this board. Bill and I have been doing this work for a number of years with different utilities, and as you saw from Bill's bio, and as I think you all know, Bill has huge experience in his 16 years of service on the SPUD board and his work on CalPERS board. And I, of course, have been working as a consultant on governance for over 20 years now. I remember coming in 2015 at the invitation of Director McGuire and others to really talk about governance. And I remember working with the board starting in 2015 to really, what I would call, build the garden of governance, of good governance at OPPD. And so here we are, 2020, some new board members, some existing board members on this board. And our experience, Bill's and my experience, is that this is the work that you continually have to do if you're going to be good custodians of a system of governance, is keep looking at the principles of it, understanding what's working well, tweaking those areas that need to be tweaked. And so I think today is all about looking at the governance processes you have, how you're making sure that those processes are working well for you as a board, as well as for Tim and the senior management team. Tomorrow, as Craig and Tim alluded to, is a day to look at the policies themselves. So today, I think, is a good building block for tomorrow's discussion. Just a couple of ground rules before I will turn it over to Bill to both introduce himself and also to start going into our report and our recommendations. I think you've already heard the theme of keeping it as productive as we can. That to me means being focused on what we're talking about. We'll keep a parking lot of agenda items. If items not on the agenda or not on our the pathway toward today's key principles come up, we'll note them and put them on a parking lot so they can be dealt with perhaps tomorrow or another time. So please stay focused. It's our job. It's as facilitators to keep reining it back and keeping people focused. So I apologize in advance if I jump in and suggest that we're off topic and try to bring it back, but that is part of my job and our job. Another key ground rule, I think, for today is to really ask good questions. We like questions in the form of, help me better understand this or that, as opposed to questions that masquerade as assertions of opinion, such as, why didn't we do this? Or how come we didn't consider that? So really an open curiosity about what you see in front of you would be very welcome today. And lastly, the purpose of today is to look forward and to how to continually improve what's happening at OPPD. It's not to relitigate the past or relive the past. If there are lessons learned from the past, let's by all means, express what those lessons are. But I, again, feel it's an obligation to reel it back if we start to get into reliving past experiences. So I think those ground rules, I'm just going to sort of lay them out there. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we do more than just that. And with that, I want to turn it over to Bill and ask him to introduce himself and then get right into our report and our recommendations. Bill? Bill, you're muted. Hey, Bill, you're muted.
There we go. All right, first error of the day. So good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank all the board members for your public service and each of your commitments to the community, and also your willingness to self-critique. That's probably one of the most important characteristics of being a good board member. And I, of course, appreciate that commitment because I was in your position for 16 years on the Sacramento Municipal Utility District Board, or SMUD. By the way, after being off the board for 18 months, I expected my hair would turn back to brown, but it doesn't work that way, I guess. So as we move into our observation and recommendations, as you all know, we spent time with each of you on the phone. Just so everyone that's at this meeting or attending this meeting who's not part of OPPD, I just want to briefly go over the acronyms we're going to be using. GP means governance process, enumerating the responsibilities of the board and board members. BL refers to board staff linkage, which are the delegations to the chief executive. And SD means strategic direction, and those are the results the board wants the organization to achieve. So with that, we'll move to our observations, and those observations then resulted in recommendations in our report. So first of all, our overall impression was there's very strong ownership on the part of the board and the CEO for the policy governance framework and processes. So that was good to hear, and that was essentially universal. The directors strongly agree that the governance of OPPD is working well, that the framework is viewed as an effective basis for the board and management to clarify roles and communicate the direction of the utility. And the OPPD board members feel a very high degree of ownership of this policy governance framework. So those were all good kind of overall observations we had. So now let me drill down to some of the conclusions we reached from our discussions with you. So we see a need for board members to continue to build that shared understanding of the board's role and also the limitations on that role. So how the board's role in formulating SD policies dovetails with those delegations, the BLs, to the CEO. So that's going to be recommendation number 1 in our report, and we'll come back to this after I review all of the observations. So next, we observed a need to continue to clarify the understanding of the circumstances under which the CEO is expected to communicate to the board about forthcoming management actions. And that is entailed in recommendation number 2 in our report. Next, we heard a need to further clarify the manner in which individual board members can communicate requests for information and or make suggestions to the CEO. And that's in our recommendation number 3. And next, we saw a need to clarify the process for refining the board's policies. So this includes the process of deciding whether to consider revising a given GP, BL, or SD policy, and also the process of actually revising the policy. So this dovetails with how the board's going to use its work plan and refines its work plan. And those are contained in 3 recommendations, number 4, 5, and 6 in our report, and we'll get to those. And we also saw a need to clarify how the board can be an effective conduit for public voices and public recommendations. And so you'll see that in recommendation number 7 in our report. Now, 3 of these recommendations we'll take up when we get to agenda item 4, the process for refining the board's policies. And those are recommendations 4, 5, and 6. So now we'll move to agenda item 3, which is discussion of key policy principles and recommendations from our report. And after we do each one, Eric's going to survey you and get your commentary on this and what your sense of what you've heard. So we want to discuss 4 of our recommendations, and as we do this, we'll be refreshing some of the principles that underpin policy governance. And I'll be adding some commentary based on my experience as an elected board member at SMUD. So let's move to recommendation number 1, which is refreshing the board's understanding of its role and how the board's SD policies dovetail with the delegations, the BLs, to the CEO. So the GPs, of course, define the board's role, SDs provide the board latitude to set direction, and the BLs define the delegations that we talked about earlier and set limits on the board's role. So under policy governance, the board defines the outcome it wants OPP to achieve via the SD policies. So those policies are intended to provide a stable, predictable set of expectations upon which the CEO and management can base their planning and their budgeting assumptions. Those policies are in effect until the board changes them. Particularly with regard to some of the SDs, it's important to accept that the planning horizons in the utility space are long and the investments take years to fully materialize. So the board delegates the CEO the authority to interpret the SDs and use best judgment in putting in place the strategies, the programs, and the other policies to achieve those desired results. So if individual board members disagree with the CEO's interpretation, then they can and essentially are obligated to try to get the policy changed. Otherwise, the board and individual board members need to be self-disciplined in their roles and grant the latitude delegated to the CEO to interpret its policies. This can have very long-term positive impact in attracting high-quality management to OPPD and assuring long-term performance. I have to say that during my time on the SMUD board, I was responsible, of course, along with the rest of the board, in the hiring of 2 CEOs. So I can attest to the validity of this, that candidates who may consider senior positions at the utility are watching your board meetings, checking and seeing how you operate as an institution. Those principles are embedded in the GP and BL policies. So Eric, why don't you do a Q&A around this first recommendation and get some reaction.
So let's use the raise hands feature if we can. If people want to comment on what you just heard Bill talk about or ask a question, again, I would prefer, if we can, to focus initially on questions about, again, how to maintain this balance between an appreciation of the board's role, the individual board members' role, as well as the CEO's role in this overall policy governance framework. I'm looking at my participants and hoping that I can see raised hands. Maybe somebody can help me too if they see any raised hands. I don't see any right now. Also, let me just turn to a director and ask, and so Janice, let me turn to you if I can. So as you think about your learning curve and appreciating this balance between kind of what the board does, individual board members can do, and how the delegations to the CEO work within the framework of policy governance, what have been some of the big learnings for you or aha moments for you that have helped you kind of appreciate how this all works?
I think since our in December, we had a meeting with some of the board members and some of senior management, and we talked a lot about the dual role of boards and how that we have both a governance and an oversight role. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important that these SDs encompass both of those roles. Mm-hmm. Because we are public power, we don't have another entity above us at the state level that tells us other than whether or not we can build a new plant or a new generation facility, and making sure that we balance those 2 roles and that these SDs and all of our board staff linkages and all of our governing documents reflect both of those roles and encompass the entire, all of the aspects of those roles, and maybe up to and including some consumer advocacy role, because we don't even have in our state a consumer advocate at the state level that helps our customer owners. So, I think finding that balance when you're wearing really 3 different hats and have 3 different roles that you have to balance, and making sure that you're fulfilling all the responsibilities that go along with those roles. So I don't know, that was kind of long, but
Well, that's a really helpful kind of intro to the board's discussion, and you're touching on a point which we're going to try to cover later on when we talk about our recommendation 7, which is how are you already, and how can you become a good conduit of a public voice as a board member. And so we actually are going to return right to that theme, Janice. Thank you. Other comments? Other folks want to say something here before we move on to our next recommendation?
I see Eric has his hand raised, and so does Rick. Eric.
Oh, okay, great. So let's start with Eric. Eric, and then we'll have Rick.
Yeah, I would echo what Janice said, having been on the board for a similar amount of time. I also found the RAP workshop in December helpful. We had gone through several different pretty important processes during 2019. And so by the end of the year, I had enough experience to kind of be familiar with how SD policy or monitoring reports were submitted and policy updates were considered, as well as some of the resource planning activities that we did and customer engagement. And so, as Janice said, that idea of dual roles, as it was described by RAP, was important. I, at the time, took a note that I had thought was, I continue to come back to about 3 roles of a director, specifically including that last part of customer advocate. And that's something that I think is pretty important to get to. So I appreciate that you have mentioned that and have time for that in the future. But understanding, director as in participation in the operations of the organization, regulators specifically related to rate making and oversight, and then customer advocate in hearing directly from the people we represent. I think that Nebraska's situation is unique because we are an all public power state, and so we don't have some of the other external governance mechanisms that other places might have, Public Utility Commission, that kind of stuff. So understanding these roles, I think, is really important, and I appreciate the work that we have collectively put in to get to that. And the workshop last year in August, and the workshop from RAP in December, and now today, I think this is really helpful. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Rick?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it, the opportunity to speak. Bill, I liked how you introduced the concept of the SD policies as forming a stable and predictable set of expectations. The way I heard it, and maybe you didn't mean it this way, but the way I heard it is there's expectations for senior management about the board's desires related back to mission. It's so the SDs have got to be and I think they are a two-way channel of discussion. Where the struggle is when the expectation envisioned by the board or board members or board member in the language of the SD policy does not become evident in the actions of SMT. And I have a real struggle with, and this will come up a little bit later, the precision of language in the SDs on setting those expectations and still having latitude to delegate authority and the responsibility to the CEO. What happens when, and I'm not picking on any one person, this is the structure we've got. What happens when the actions are not as expected when we wrote those policies? So it's the elephant and the blind men, right? So we've got that elephant in the language of the SD, and everybody brings their own biases or their own views as to what's happening there. And your background or history can lead you to presume outcome A, what you get is outcome B, and without expressing ill intent or anything. That's the struggle, I think, for me.
Bill, did you want to briefly kind of respond to that before we move
Yeah.
on to the next
Yeah,
recommendation?
I think, Rick, that what you've brought up is a very key issue. I think we're going to get in our recommendations to some of this. We're going to drill down to more detail, because that's where that balance comes in. The degree to which the language creates constraints on management is the as I call it, the team sport, where it is worked out as to what works well for the utility. But that interpretation of the words, it's so critical for the entire board to come to a conclusion on what those words mean and have management agree that that's what those words mean. That's the kind of the secret sauce of making those SDs work. It's not perfect. They will change, and particularly when new board members come in, they may have a different interpretation. So we're going to talk about that, some maybe help in the process of how you reconcile that kind of an issue. Because you're right, that's a tough part of this.
Mm-hmm. Bill, let's go on to the next recommendation if we can.
Okay.
Hey, Eric, real quick, if you wouldn't mind. I mean, I think that's these are interesting concepts, because the strategic directives, as at least as I have been educated and as we begin to draft them, are meant to be strategic. And I think sometimes what happens is that we try to take a strategic directive and make it a tactical execution and how. And I think that's the struggle we get into, based on different people's backgrounds, perspectives, experiences. In my thought, those strategic directives are to be out multiple years as we begin to think about. And certainly the monitoring and the execution of that strategic directive may change based on a number of external and internal parameters that may occur in the organization. But I think that becomes some of that maybe conflict that we hear and we see sometimes. And so for us to get clarity around that, I think is going to be really important. And of course, my preference as a CEO is a much broader perspective on strategic directives to allow that flexibility for the senior management team to execute and to deliberate.
Yeah. I have, as we move into this recommendation number 2, I think your thoughts, Tim, are well taken. And I think the board, in consult with management, has to say, how tightly or loosely do we construct these? And what's the impact on the utility if they are tightened down to, more and more? And so that's the dialogue that goes back and forth to reach a conclusion. The conclusion essentially is a vote by the board. That's the conclusion. So let's move to number 2, which is, and I think that's your conversation is a good lead into this, which is refresh the board's understanding of the expectations for communication from the CEO. So through our interviews, we learned that some board members want to discuss how the CEO keeps the board informed so that the board, before management acts, can assess whether the current policies accurately reflect the board's view. That creates a dilemma because, and I'll say this because I've experienced this at SMUD as well. What happens when new board members come on board? So does the CEO have an obligation to put on hold further programmatic changes until the board has a chance to weigh in on potential changes to its policies? And if so, what impact does that have on the organization? Because remember, we talked about early on how a lot of the issues are long-term in nature, require years to implement, and the ship can't turn on a dime. So I think that's a critical issue here, because as we believe governance is, and we said this before, is a team sport. And that means you have to have collegiality, you have to have trust, and a teamwork approach. That doesn't mean that it's rubber stamping what management wants. But what it does mean is using the governance process to work toward the best outcomes. And that is not easy to do. It's not fast, but it's the only way you can really have the best outcomes. So what I would like to do is, Eric, if you'll share the Oppd BL7, we can put that up on the screen.
Okay, I just need to be able to get control.
Eric, I'm going to pass the ball to you, okay?
Okay.
Let's see.
So I'm just, Bill, I'm just waiting to share while I.
Sure.
There we go.
Sure.
So can you see that policy?
Well, it's your start. Yeah, there it is. Okay, it's up there. So there's a requirement in BL7 that the CEO keep the board informed about actions that he or she plans to take. And the language reads, where is it? If the CEO reasonably determines that an activity related to the delegations presents an operational risk to the district in any way, the CEO shall inform the board and may request appropriate action. So that's good. I like that language, but I'd like you to compare that to the language that SMUD uses. And I want to talk about some differences between those two. And I think they're subtle, but they're important. And so when Eric gets that up, so it starts out, let's see, we'll get to it shortly. There we go. So if the CEO, and you're going to have to scroll a little bit, so you can see, by the way, if you notice up above how often these policies have been modified, where the board has looked at them and said, we think, again, in consult with management, that we need to make some changes to it. So some of them not very often, others a lot. So if the CEO reasonably determines that an activity related to the delegation presents, and these are key words, regardless of the size of the financial commitment, a unique and significant operational risk, a significant impact to customers, significant impact to community relations, and significant impact to SMUD's reputation, or materially compromises the policies and goals established by the board. Again, then the CEO shall timely inform the board, may request the board take action. So we recommend that the board consider including some or all of these elements. It doesn't mean that it's bulletproof. It doesn't mean that it is going to cure any problem that you think you may have, but it does send a directional information to management to pay attention to those types of things. So Eric, you want to take over?
Yeah, so thank you, Bill. Well done. And I guess, Tim, I'd first like to turn to you because I know this would impose additional expectations with regard to your role if such language were adopted by the board. And so I think initially, I would love to hear from you the extent to which you see the value in listing these kinds of circumstances under which you would be expected to communicate information back to the board.
Yeah, I would say 1 through 5, at least in the document that I have in the SMUD BL7. I think that occurs. It may occur in a formalized quarterly meeting that I have with each board member individually, where we talk about updated items, significant items that may be coming. And then on the emergent things where there may be a customer related issue, an operational related issue, a legal issue, a regulatory issue, we would send that directly to the board with that update and that guidance and perspective. And so, I would say this would not have significant impact because I think we do that today. And it may be done through a senior manager, let's say on the generation side or on a nuclear side, may address the systems committee on a specific issue. We may then talk to the rest of the board members outside of the systems committee on whatever that, let's say a nuclear regulatory issue may be or not be, to inform the board what it is and allow the board the opportunity then to engage back if they have further discussion or dialogue or items around that.
Thank you, Tim. I'm recalling back when I was facilitating the development of BL7 for SMUD, that this was an evolving policy. I mean, Bill showed how many times it's been updated. And one of the evolutions was certainly the kind of additional definition. And Rick, to your point about language and precision of language, this was a way in which, in that particular board, they wanted to just make sure there was precision about the communication to the CEO of those circumstances in which they view the board, the board, expect to get updates and information. So we're not going to try to, I think, today decide whether to include this, but I think what Bill is suggesting and I'm suggesting is this is worth considering in light of our interviews as a potential way to continually refine the way in which you think about the expectations. So Craig, I want to just turn to you first for comment on this. I'm just kind of curious as you hear the discussion, hear Tim's feedback on this, just initial impressions or thoughts?
Well, if it in essence reflects the way that it works today, or the way that we want it to work today, then I don't see any downside. I never want to muddy up policies with more language if it's not there very intentionally and deliberately. So that would be my only caution. But by and large, that language strikes me as fairly straightforward, reasonable, and to Tim's point, it seems to reflect kind of the way that he's approaching communication to us anyway.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, are you able to participate? Are you hearing my voice and can you speak?
Oh, absolutely.
There you are.
I'm here contemplating what I'm going to say.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious from your perspective and your life as an OPPD trustee, the extent to which you see value in perhaps expanding this definition of circumstances in which the CEO would be expected to communicate back to the board.
Yeah, so similar to what Craig said. I don't know. I appreciate Tim's comment. Actually, as we were reading through this, I was thinking, oh, I wonder what Tim would do differently if this was the language we had. So I appreciate you guys addressing that initially here. Mm-hmm. I think what we as a board need to consider is, even though that's how Tim is communicating with us and addressing these things now, that might not be what a successor might do. And so if we need to put the framework in, if this is what we want to see happen, then I think we do need to formalize it in a way so that it stands the test of time, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good observation, Amanda, to take that long-term sustainability of OPPD perspective. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you think the impact of this expanded language might be, positive or negative.
Well, I think we could have it. I think we already do have it. And to Amanda's comment, as far as succession, I asked the question to my other directors, do we already have that with our risk management policy report that we get every quarterly? Mm-hmm. It seems like we already have that. I don't know if I could have some other comments from Tim or somebody else related to that.
Tim, what would you say to that?
Yeah, and I'll let Scott, what we do is we categorize our enterprise risks into multiple categories that have either significant dollar or significant operational impacts. And we do that through the enterprise risk management process that we've established, which I think is very strong, very thorough, very well documented. When I read this, I was not thinking of that, to be very honest with you, and so that's a really good point, because we do go over those, what we consider large enterprise risks based on those valuations. I read that as being a more emergent related issues or more emergent operational risks or significant risks or, whatever that may be. The example, would be when the derecho came through Omaha. I think we had Troy directly respond with some of the updates on outages directly to the board to give them that update on what was going on in the restoration crews that were coming in and those kinds of activities. And to me, that falls in this. We wouldn't really talk about that in an enterprise risk necessarily. So to me, I see those more as those emergent things that aren't part of a normal kind of process that we would go through with the board.
Mm-hmm. Tim, can I just ask you a follow-up question on that? So again, remembering back to the SMUD experience, I recall there were times when SMUD was going through periods where there was pretty significant, emotion in the community about initiatives that SMUD was going to undertake. I go back, Bill, particularly to the annexation of Yolo County, the primary, Davis and so forth. And I believe that some of the context for this expanded language came as a result of the desire from board members to get more of an update and to be more engaged as you thought about the potential impact on community relations for some of the moves that, in that case, SMUD, in your case, OPPD, was going to make. But I'm curious from a community relations perspective, kind of, if this language were in place, would that impact your thinking if there were an event to occur soon that had a significant community relations impact? Help me understand how that might shade your thinking about informing the board.
Yeah, I mean, I think one is we would have had a conversation with the board before that would have occurred. Now, again, if it's an emergent issue that is based on some other action, let's use siting of solar or natural gas facilities. I think the board, we have briefed the board on a monthly basis on the status of that and the ongoing, and if there are emergent items, we'll send an email to the board or have a conversation with the board on, hey, here's an update, wanted to share with you what that update is, here's what's going on. They get all of our media reports, so if there's a media request, they'll get a summary of what we talked with the media about. They can recognize that article or that report may be coming out, and they understand what our response is to that. In some cases, on maybe a deeper or broader community activity, we have done, I think, a very good job of providing the board talking points and pre-questions that may get asked of them, with at least perspectives of answers from a senior management perspective of what those answers are. So I think we've done that very well in that regard, and kept them in the conversation and in the loop of what that may look like. I mean, I'd be interested in what the board would say about that. But from my perspective, I think we have significantly increased our communication with the board over certainly the last 5 years and maybe even more over the last 3 years, that I think the board gets a lot of information from us, and then a weekly board update, just a number of different activities that may be going on in the district that doesn't show up in a board agenda item, doesn't show up maybe in a significant operational issue report, but they get an update of a variety of operational things going on in the district.
Yeah. So I am curious to hear from board members on this particular point, not looking backward, but looking ahead to the future and thinking about, upcoming initiatives that OPPD might undertake. If this language around providing updates to the board on significant impacts to community relations or to OPPD's reputation, if that language were in place, what would be your expectations of communication from the CEO, and were they differ in any way from what you just heard Tim talk about? So for that specific question, I would turn to whomever wishes to speak, and I can't see the hands up at this moment. So
yeah, Eric, you've got Rick and Janice both with hands up.
Okay, thank you, Craig.
Yep.
So Rick, let me start with you, and then Janice.
Yeah, I don't have any particular. Well, you said not to look historically, but I'll go ahead and throw this out because I think Tim and his crew do a pretty good job on this. So, so if you'll allow me that historical note, the looking ahead, I don't have any concrete actions I would expect different. I would have to think about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
My question, though, to you is a help me understand kind of question.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if the language is in place and the board determines that the action does not occur?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is one of the advantages of having the language in place, because if you're thinking about the performance evaluation of the CEO, I do think that you have to take into account not only the performance with regard to the strategic directions, but also the performance with regard to the delegations to the CEO. And so this additional language, I think, provides you a place in which to say in an annual evaluation or in some feedback to your CEO, hey, this didn't quite meet our expectation. Here's the specific case that occurred. And it enables that feedback to occur against the backdrop of the board's agreed upon more language with regard to this risk. And so I do think it provides an avenue for you. And Bill may be able to speak to kind of how that happened at SMUD, but I'm quite confident. I don't get behind the closed doors all the time with regard to CEO evaluations. God forbid it ever should be, but I think this gets to the heart of some of those conversations.
Well, actually, several years ago, SMUD had authorized, or the board had authorized, a multi-million-dollar rebuild of the campus of the main headquarter building, which had been built in 1955. And so that project started, and then lo and behold, suddenly about 50 trees were taken out of around the building. I mean, just leveled. Now, the team had to take those out because they were problems in being able to do the project, et cetera. Totally, some were dying, et cetera. I mean, totally logical. But the fact is, the most valuable program at SMUD in terms of customer view is the Sacramento Tree Foundation program. So here we are advocating for planting trees everywhere, and we suddenly take out 50 trees at headquarters. So that happened, and the board was not briefed ahead of time. So I can tell you there were some conversations about that in regard to this policy, and I'm sure it had some bearing on evaluation at a later date of the CEO.
So Rick, hopefully that kind of helps address your question. And Janice, I don't want to lose the fact that you had your hand up as well. So turn to you.
Since we're looking forward and not backward, informing the board in a timely manner when we see significant changes in load or even if or when there is an expectation that something needs to be done, and then all the work is done behind the scenes for over a year before the board is informed. I'm not sure that meets the timely notion there. And so, I think this wording could help us to make sure that some of the things that have happened in the past aren't repeated. Mm-hmm. And I think that, Eric, I talked to you about this when we did our interview. Mm-hmm. So that feeling that when something is identified and senior management is spending significant time and resources working on something behind the scenes for a period of time before the board is aware of the issue, I think this wording could help that going forward. Mm-hmm.
So other thoughts? We have a number of recommendations to go through, but I'm hearing, at least from a couple of board members, that there's some potential value in adding this language to BL7. If anybody feels that would not be a useful addition, I'd love to hear them speak. And by the way, Mike Kavanaugh, I haven't called on you yet, and so I don't know if you can hear my voice, but if you could unmute and give us your quick reaction to this language, I would very much appreciate it.
Initially it looks good. It's something before I totally commit. I want to see it in a hard copy. Discuss that further. It is unfortunate that we have to even consider this to improve the communications with the CEO. We have to consider also that sometimes it's the expectations and the approach that directors take as well that might help in this relationship as much as any type of written policy.
But to this particular point, though, Mike, I'm hearing you express support.
How was that?
Any other board members wish to comment before we move on?
Yeah, I'll just go quick. This is something that we've discussed before, and even going back, I'll say 3 to 6 months, we had a really good discussion about it and put some things in place to improve it. And I think yes, this language helps, sure, but I also think probably perhaps more importantly is the manner and frequency in which informal communication happens. And that's really where the rubber honestly meets the road, is the extent to which that happens. And again, because we've discussed it, because we put some things in place already, I think we've already taken some pretty meaningful steps to improve that. Mm-hmm. The thought that I have, and maybe this is just a question that remains unanswered for future consideration, is what the line of communication is and or should be, which is to say, as the chair, I'm always wondering, like Tim and I have a lot more expansive conversations than I imagine Tim having with most other board members. So the challenge that I have as a chair on occasion is, to what extent do I need to take that and summarize it and send it to board members? And generally speaking, I don't view that as my key role. Mm-hmm. As a chair, I trust, and again, Tim and I have talked about this, so I think the way in which communication is happening today, I think is we've taken some great strides towards seeing some improvement. Mm-hmm.
You know, Eric, I'll give you a great example on the feedback that I got on my performance effectiveness appraisal, where some board members had said, you know, Tim doesn't cover the items that I really want him to cover in my one-on-ones. And so this quarter, I sent it out to the board and said, tell me what you want me to talk about, and we'll frame it that way. I'll have my items I want, but give me some feedback on what that looks like, and I will incorporate those into our quarterly meetings. So it gives them the opportunity to control what some of those items may be in that communication or that discussion or that dialogue. And I think it is kind of interesting that, you know, there may be things that are kind of incremental as they move from quarter to quarter or month to month, that we do share with the board that ends up being a relatively large project. But, you know, I do share those where we are and what that status and the things that we're working on relative to the board in those quarterly meetings and quarterly updates. And so what I'm doing now is sending them the agendas so they can keep the agendas and know what we talked about 2 or 3 months later. So they know that we've talked about some of those items and have documentation around that as well.
Cool. Cool. And obviously you're adhering to what any good CEO does, which is, if I'm sending the information to one board member, all my board members are getting it. Right. Rick, you had your hand up. I'm sorry, no, Rick, you've spoken. Eric, you had your hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, great, thank you. Kind of a point of clarification. This says inform the board and then appropriate actions. And I guess I'm curious where that extends into information available for public to provide input to board members in order for us to make decisions, and how we balance this, or are there other locations that more accurately describe information to the public? And again, this echoes the comment about Nebraska as a special case, as an all public power state, where there are decisions that I would prefer not to make without having had the opportunity for people to provide input to me. Mm-hmm. And so is this the place where that should be covered, or is that covered somewhere else? Can you help me understand the difference between this and that?
Yeah, so I would make 2 points really quickly, Eric. One is the role you play as a board in hearing and obtaining public and stakeholder feedback is really explained in GP2 and GP3, which we're going to get to in just a moment and talk about. So hold that thought until we talk about those things. I would just make a larger point here, and it goes maybe a little bit to the sort of the holistic approach to looking at all your policies on a regular basis. In our interviews, we discovered that really the monitoring processes that the board goes through are focused mainly on the strategic directive policies and not so much on these GP and GL policies. And one of the things that I think Bill and I would both recommend is that you find a way to more regularly remind yourselves of what's in these BLs and GP policies, because it really is, it goes to the cornerstones of some of these policy governance questions that Eric just raised. And so I think just that regular refreshing and updating of that language as appropriate in the GP and BLs will help you address some of these role and process related questions that the SDs, frankly, are not intended to address, or not intended to address in the same way. Bill, if we could, let's keep moving along
Sure.
because we've got time here that we need to adhere
We have a lot
to.
to cover.
Yeah, a lot
There's a lot
to
to cover. Okay, so the next recommendation number 3 is to clarify and check for really complete understanding of the board's unity of control policy. That's the BL5. So that is a central tenet of policy governance. And it says that only the board acting as an entity can give direction to the CEO. So Eric's going to put that policy up, but it's intentionally designed to avoid confusion, inefficiencies, and risk that occur when different individuals try to steer the organization. Now, the problem with it is it takes time. It takes collaboration. It takes consideration to change one of the board's policies and thus redirect the organization. So it's really important that every board member really internalize that unity of control. So one of the things we heard in our interview, and it kind of relates to this policy, that both board members and management cited instances when board members try to give individual direction or make suggestions to Oppd, to the CEO and to management. So the question is a suggestion merely that, or is it an instruction? Because, you know, from my experience, board members' voices are louder than anyone else's voices. So, and management really naturally wants to meet what board members want. I think that's just human nature, and it's the nature of these organizations. So this unity of control is designed to be a kind of a gating factor for that. From my experience, the level of civility and respect between board members and between board members and senior leadership can really have a profound effect on the utility, and in particular have an effect on those that are observing you, because you are in a public space, as you know, so people are watching. So we heard instances in which board members, for example, were critical of OPPD staff. So those critiques that occurred, and it's the use of language, are interpreted by some senior staff members as evaluations of their performance. That can be very demoralizing. So I would say that all of you as board members, you don't have the full picture of a senior manager's performance. And so really, you don't want to tread in that particular territory. And that goes to positive evaluation as well as negative, although the negative is the one that hurts the most. But so you got to be mindful of the impact of your words when you're talking to management. So let me give you an example. So during presentations by staff in public meetings, are you saying, help me better understand? Or are you saying, why didn't we do this? Or why didn't you consider that? It's just, you can get to the same point, but it's a very different way of expressing yourself. And I think in a public environment, it shows respect. It shows that you're on a team, and yet you're also wanting to get to a particular issue that can have an impact on the organization. So let's look at the difference in BL5 between OPPD's BL5 and SMUD's corresponding policy. And I have to say, I'm not saying that SMUD is perfect or that you should implement everything that SMUD did, but I think it's instructive to look at the comparison. So in this case, we're looking at the SMUD policy. So, and I'll just say that the OPPD policy says board members shall refrain from conducting performance evaluations for any OPPD employee or staff member other than the CEO. That's very crisp, very clear. The SMUD one says board members will refrain from evaluating either formally or informally any staff. And also the board as a body will refrain, and it goes through the same sentence. So the adding of the words informally, formally or informally, gets to this issue where in dialogue, in questioning management in regard to reports or whatever it is they're talking about, your use of language is important, and you want to avoid giving the appearance that you are evaluating that person's performance in a public setting, or in any setting, actually. public or private. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. So I do want to kind of go through 2 points that I think we just made. One is just to make sure that we have a chance to kind of reappreciate what is in OPPD's unity of control policy. So I'm just going to go back and reshare the OPPD unity of control policy. So again, decisions or instructions of individual directors, officers, or committees are not binding on the CEO, except in instances when the board has specifically authorized that. In the cases where individual directors or committees request information or assistance without board authorization, the CEO must refuse such requests that require, in his or her opinion, material amount of time or staff or funds or are disruptive. And directors shall have full and open access to senior management and other OPPD employees in order to ask questions and receive information. However, the board as a body and individual directors will not give direction to them. And board members shall refrain from conducting performance evaluations. I want to get to the performance evaluations thing in just a second. I do want to just check for understanding around the key tenets of unity of control here. And the way that I think Bill was helpful was saying how you frame a suggestion has a huge bearing on whether management appreciates that you are doing it from the perspective of a full awareness of this unity of control policy or not. If you say, I don't understand why we didn't do this, that starts, or why didn't we consider this? That starts to sound like I'm trying to give direction and instruction as opposed to help me understand. I'm curious to know what were the implications? How did you consider this? What was the thinking behind this, and so forth? Those can be either perspective or retrospective. The unity of control is absolutely fundamental to good policy governance and to good board governance. So just comments on this one. Again, I want to just make sure that we check for understanding here before we move on. I'm going to look at my participants and just see if there's anybody with a raised hand who wants to comment on this or say anything. Maybe specifically to, are there areas of where people feel like this is unclear? So Tim, I see your hand is up, and Mike Kavanaugh, I see your hand is up. Tim, did you want to speak first to this?
I have a stale hand. Sorry about
Stale
that.
hand,
Let
okay.
me take my stale hand down. So.
Mike, did you want to speak to this?
Just 2 quick comments. First off, in particular, the 4th bullet in doing the individual evaluations, we did this rewriting this bullet here a short time ago. I do like the example you guys used from SMUD. That might make things a little bit clearer. And secondly, I want to ask you a question. How common is it with organizational structures like OPPD, where you have a board of directors more so than a designated elected leader, if you will? How common is it for to have issues with the CEO having to deal with individual directors making requests, roguely, if you will, away from the board as a whole?
It happens in every single board we work with, Mike. Yep. It's inevitably a consequence of the role that board members play, especially an elected board member plays, but also an appointed board member plays in wanting individually to have certain things happen that are important to his or her agenda in getting elected, to promises they've made in campaign, promises they've made if it's a political appointment to the appointing authority. And so inevitably there's a chafing here against unity of control. It's inevitable. I think what has to happen is you have to, as a board member, appreciate what is the value of maintaining the discipline around unity of control in order to assure that senior management, and in particular your CEO, feel that there's a high level of trust in that line between what has the board said we need to do as a board versus what is an individual board member saying we need to do. And I already have heard that confusion through the interviews that we conducted, that somehow individual board members still should have their expectations met by the CEO. And there is no expectation that that should happen under policy governance. An individual board member has very little authority and power under policy governance. They only have the power to be persuasive of their colleagues. And when they get to 5 votes, then suddenly all sorts of magic can happen. But it's the getting to the 5 votes that that you actually start to, that's when you wield authority as an entity. So Mike, to your question, it happens everywhere. It's why we have a full-time practice in board governance, because this is where we have to come in and really help board members remember the importance of this role and the discipline around this role.
Okay, thanks.
Anne, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the one thing as far as maybe if you can help us talk a little bit about the role of the committees. Right now, it's good because we have only 4 members of our committee. But when you have 4 more people, that provides a lot more power or influence over that senior management or that CEO. And if you can talk about that a little bit as far as your suggestions.
Well, I've been talking a lot. I'm going to turn this one over to my colleague, Bill, and Bill can speak to this one.
Are you talking about? Can you hear me okay, Ann?
We can. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. So help me understand, are you talking about the difference between asking for things in a committee setting versus the board setting? Help me understand that.
Well, if you look at the decisions or instructions of individual directors, officers, or committees are not binding on the CEO. And just the idea that if you have a committee of 4, the power or influence that may have over that senior management or CEO, I think that's a very important thing that people recognize. Committees too don't have that power because they don't have the 5 votes there. And I think sometimes that might be confused a little.
Well, I think there's a balance. At SMUD, for example, committee, it's a 7-person board. Committees were 3. So again, it was not a majority of the board on the committee. But what would happen is, and I think Craig has now adopted this, if I'm not mistaken, we created something called summary of committee direction. So the committee by the end of the meeting, the chair would go over what if there were requests for things, to-dos by the executive who was the liaison for that particular committee, and they would go over that in public and talk about it and agree to what those deliverables were going to be. But I think at the same time, even though that's a minority and doesn't have the power of 4 votes in the case of SMUD or 5 for you, the CEO or his representative would chime in if in fact this was going to present a difficulty or was going to present a problem. And so you might then defer it to the board. I never saw that happen because it would be worked out in committee to make sure that the requests were reasonable.
Mm-hmm. But I would just underscore the point that the committees are working for the board. The committee recommendations are intended to go to the board. It's the board that makes the decisions as an entity. The committees are really advisory to the board. Exactly. Are there other questions or hands up here? Rick, I see your hand up. So please.
I just wanted to reiterate what I think I'm hearing. Is that only the vote of 5 and action is what is meant by unity of control. If 5 board members were to say same thing at a public meeting.
No, not the same. No, it would have to be in the form of a written policy because that's part of the other aspects of policy governance that you've adopted, which is that the board expresses itself through a written policy. Now, you also obviously express your will through resolutions that are put before you and other mechanisms, but the primary sort of rudder you have to guide the organization is through your written policies. And so you need 5 votes to adopt a change in language or a new policy, Rick, in order to steer the ship.
So, I'm sorry. Eric,
are you going to build on what he just said, or are you going a different direction, Eric?
I was going to follow on what Rick said.
Okay, go.
So I guess in order for things to make it to the board for a vote, there does need to be quite a bit of work by staff in some cases. And so following on what Rick said, if a committee believes that a certain course of action is appropriate, it's challenging to understand how large, intense projects will end up moving to the point of a vote without a specific, moving to the point of a recommendation and a vote at a board meeting without some direction prior to that. I guess I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly how, as we make decisions or as we provide input as to what types of things, would make it to the board for a vote, how do we resolve that?
That's a great question. So if we can, that's all to the question that I think, and we think, of what exactly is your process for refining or creating a new policy. And while we agreed on some basic principles around that, I think based on our interviews, Eric, there's a need for further clarification of what that process looks like. And so that's agenda item, that's the next agenda item for us to discuss about. So if we can just hold that thought, we'll get to it. Craig?
Yeah, not muted. The comment that the question that Rick asked and the way that you responded to that, Eric, I think I understand the importance of having, written, documented, approved policies, BLs, GPs, resolutions, whatever they might be. But my experience, and it's not that long, but practically speaking, is that that's not the only way in which the board sort of provides guidance and direction to senior management. I think it does happen, in a conversation, in a board meeting where, and Tim does, I think, a pretty good job of this. And my goal as chair is to try and suss out whether or not there's general consensus without a specific vote. But there are definitely times where I think the board is sort of kind of migrating in a particular direction. And oftentimes these are not things that are on our agenda for an action. They're brought to the board because senior management is saying, hey, here's where we're at, interested in what questions you have. We'd like to kind of give you an update and just kind of get a sense for where you're at. And that's the point at which the board sort of, it's not meaningful, but it's kind of a nudge, right, of the rudder a little bit here or there. So I do think that, I want to acknowledge that I do think that happens today. And I don't think it's, it doesn't have to be the written formal policy, so to speak, in every case.
So the kind of nudge you're talking about, Craig, can you just give us a quick example of what that nudge?
Oh, you would ask me for an example.
Well, Craig, I have one if you're interested.
Save me, Tim.
Yeah, I'll save you. So, this just happened 2 months ago. As we're going through COVID, as we did some customer solution work around deferring disconnections and late payment fees, a number of different things. And as we began to reestablish those, the board, in our board committee meeting, as Julie Comstock presented kind of, hey, here's an update, here's what's going on, here's what we're doing, suggested that, hey, and I get a sense on kind of where the board is on it. It was kind of like, that would be really good for us to see kind of monthly on the progress over the next several months to see what those trends look like. Said, fair enough, we'll do that. We'll make sure that's part of our public information work that the committee will get. We'll provide an update to the board. That's an example where we didn't do a board action, but it was kind of like, yeah, those trends would be really interesting to see, just to make sure we understand what's going on with customers and on disconnections and reconnections and late payments and the CARES Act funding that's going on that we got from the county and that related activity. So that was one where it was a pretty common acceptance from the board to say, yeah, that would be really good for us to see over the next several months. And we're going to continue to do that as we're in this kind of COVID-19 and kind of the crazy world we're in. So
thank you, Tim. I'll share one now that you've jogged my memory. One from, I think, our finance committee meetings, more specifically around not the full board, but the committee. And I'm not going to, details aren't super important, but it was a question as to kind of what the pace and timing might be for some potential rate changes that we're looking at, right? And how that fits together with some of the rate strategy stuff. And so, Javier and his team kind of brought to the committee, here's kind of where we're at. What do you think? Does this make sense? And the board, and that we wrapped that meeting up with a summary of what the committee's direction was. It wasn't a vote. but it was definitely the committee sort of stepping forward and saying, here's kind of where we're at,
Mhm.
and providing that direction without it being, a strategic directive necessarily.
Right. Well, in both those cases, and it sounds to me like what's happening, and it goes right to bullet 2 on the screen. It's not an individual director who's asked for information. Maybe an individual director came up with the idea and said, gee, wouldn't it be great if we got more regular updates on how we're responding to the pandemic, or more updates on a given project. But I'm guessing, Craig, you looked at your colleagues and you saw head nods, you saw people going, yeah, that sounds good, we'd like to see that. And then really it was an instruction to the CEO that he could have refused under bullet point 2, but he didn't. He said, no, that sounds like a good idea. And so I think all you're talking about is very consistent with the interpretation and the actual implementation of this second bullet. And it happens, that kind of stuff happens all the time.
Yeah.
But it's different than a strategic direction that is giving much more long-term direction as to investment, resources, way beyond just staff information resources. And so I do think there's kind of a scalar difference in the kind of thing we're talking about too.
Yep, I agree with that.
So if we can, so I think the other point we wanted to make then with regard to this conversation is just, if you liked the way in which it was framed in the SMUD example of BL5, and I'll reshare that, not to necessarily decide today, but the, why can't I share that? Find to share, there we go. So if you recall, this is now the language that is in the SMUD policy in D about members refraining from evaluating either formally or informally any staff. And the board as a whole refraining from evaluating formally or informally any staff other than those who report to you. Again, it's a nuance, granted, and the question is whether or not this nuance would have value in giving instruction, back to Amanda's point, to both yourselves as well as to future boards around here's the rules of the road for us. We go out of our way not to be interpreted or perceived as either formally or informally evaluating staff, particularly as Bill was talking about on the critique side, that we have to be just very careful with that line. So again, in the interest of time, not necessarily wanting to be looking for full unanimity here, but would anybody object? And by the way, welcome, Tim. I see you now. Nice to see your face and nice to have you here. Would anybody object to or have some reason to think that this would not be a useful addition to OPPD's policies? Again, I'm going to go over and find my participants and see if we've got hands up. Mo, help me if I see any. I don't see any hands up at this moment, but perhaps I see Tim Burke. Okay, Tim.
That might be stale, but Tim, you can tell us.
Oh, it's stale.
Yeah. All right.
It's stale. I'll get used to this. I'm not usually doing my hands up, so, but I'm trying to be a good participant here. So
I don't have any problem with the language. I guess for me, the challenge that I foresee us potentially running into is the nuance of what it actually looks like to formally or informally, what's the language?
Evaluate.
Yeah, I think there's probably a big gray area there where, it's up to interpretation. So I don't know that should hold us back, but that's a concern that I have about the interpretation of it.
Bill, can you speak for just a couple of seconds, just briefly on kind of what you saw as the value of including this at SMUD?
Yeah, I think one thing I noted, at least on a couple of occasions during my 16 years, so I'm not going to point to a specific instance, specific time period, but I've had situations where one board member would call another board member out of the meeting and have a conversation about what that board member said or how that board member approached the staff member, just as a reminder that words count. And so it's basically self-reinforcing by the rest of the board members or committee members to be careful about this.
Yeah. All right, well, why don't we just kind of chew on that for a bit? And Bill, I'm going to ask you if we can to move on to the next item. And after this next item, we'll take a break.
All right, very good. So the next item is a recommendation number 7, which is clarifying the role of the board in being a conduit for public voices and public representation. I think this is an absolutely critical area. You're all elected officials. You understand how important it is to be able to have conversations and to be able to understand what the public is saying. So 3 of your policies are very key in understanding how this role is defined. So we start with GP2 and GP3. Is that 2 that you have up right now?
This is 2 here, Bill, and then GP3 is right below it.
Okay. So 2 and 3 lay out the expectations for you serving as a representative. So bullet number 1 in GP2 says, you shall cultivate a sense of group responsibility. So my read of that is that means you work as a team. This is a team sport you're involved in. And then if we go to GP3, bullet number 1 says, serve as representatives of OPPD's customer owners and build relationships throughout the service territory and the region. That's pretty clear language. Number 6, bullet number 6 says that the board shall monitor stakeholder processes when necessary to ensure the board hears the strategic viewpoints and values of customer owners and other interested stakeholders. But note that it says the board. It doesn't say board members, it says the board. And I think that's very critical language to pay attention to. So if we can go to GP7, so GP7 is also important in this context of how individual board members interact with the public and gather input. This is guidelines for board member behavior.
Are you seeing GP7 now?
I see GP7.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
All right, so the board members shall conduct themselves in accordance with all laws applicable. The board members shall conduct themselves with civility and respect at all times with one another, staff, and members of the public. Board members are expected to act in the best interests of OPPD and the customer owners. And this is very important language. This supersedes any conflicting duties such as advocacy for a personal cause on behalf of interest groups or obligations to other organizations, boards, or staffs. It also supersedes the personal interest of any board member acting as a consumer of the organization's activities. So board members shall not attempt to exercise individual authority over the organization except as explicit and set forth in board policies, leading back to GP, the unity of control. Board members must recognize the limits of authority vested in them as individuals in their interactions with the CEO and with staff. And in their interactions with the public, press, or their entities, board members should recognize the same limitation and inability of any individual board member to speak for the board or for other board members except explicitly stated board decisions. And board members shall at all times endeavor to express their individual opinions in a responsible manner. Each member of the board is expected to support the legitimacy and authority of the decisions of the board. And although it's preferred that board members refrain from criticism of decisions, if they do so, they must make it clear that they're expressing their individual opinion and not the opinion of the board or other board members, so long as it complies with the limitations set forth in these policies. So I think here's the point I want to make here. How do you communicate, and this is the key question, with stakeholders and customers as a board member? How can you best navigate these waters as an elected person while keeping the success of the utility in the forefront and maintaining appropriate confidentiality? So I want to acknowledge first that these are very different approaches for board members. Some want to be out there talking to the public, some do not. There's 8 of you and you have 8 different approaches. But I have to acknowledge that the pressure on you as a board member, this is changing. With climate change, there's much more public attention, much more organizational attention to what utilities are doing, and that ups the game. It ups the pressure that's on you. And so, I would get questions, citizen request or organizational, well, how are you going to do this? How are you going to individually help change the direction for the board? And I found that sometimes you want to turn it around. So when a customer asks you, what do you think OPPD should do? You can turn around and ask them, well, what do you think? What are your recommendations? And again, the words you've heard us use all afternoon long help me better understand. And I found, I think it's important to know your SDs, to be aware of those. And one of the things that I found is you're essentially in conversations doing some teaching as well. Know your delegations to the CEO. That informs the public on how you govern as a board. And your job, it was my job when I was on the utility, is to gain information from them. I have to say that, you know, your campaigns are over with. You are elected, so campaign mode is gone. And the best thing you can do for the utility is get that perspective in a useful way from stakeholders, but bring it in-house, bring it to all the rest of the board members. So now I want to kind of step back for a moment and suggest what this might look like, because we're not suggesting that you get a line of people to speak their 3 minutes as advocates for some issue, but an organized approach in forum mode with differing views expressed and questions prepared in advance and moderated, because you want both board members and the senior management team to participate in this. So you want that balance of viewpoints, and you want everybody to get a chance to be educated at the same time. Not only does that help you in your decision making, but it demonstrates that you're open and you're available to stakeholders to address and communicate with them. But doing it as a group is much more powerful than doing it individually, because, as we've said before, it's a team sport. So have those discussions in public, in front of stakeholders and customers who may have a slightly different view. That serves everyone's interest. The more open it is, the better.
So Bill, let me just jump in here if I can, and thank you for that, and thank you for sharing your experiences at SMUD. So the purpose of this section of our discussion today is to ask board members to really clarify for yourselves this distinction between going out individually and seeking input from advocates versus the responsibility you have under GP2 and GP3 to imagine how to do that as a board, and how to make sure that if you're soliciting stakeholder input as a board member, in coordination with the CEO and coordination with your colleagues, there are organized forums in which those important topics you wish to address can be addressed with stakeholders present. Again, I have on the screen this GP3 board job description just because I think it helps to frame this discussion. So topic on the table is how you serve as effective customer representatives while at the same time, you know, managing your governance role, your oversight role. We'll just go to the participants and see who wants to talk.
Eric had his hand up. You can go first.
I see Craig and Eric both has their hands up. So
yeah, Eric, you were up first. Go ahead, man.
Okay. Great. So I mean the method of input that is most frequently in front of both the board and senior management would be the board meetings themselves. Tuesday we do not have public input, but Thursday we do. And I mean, quite frankly, the idea that input presented in a formal board meeting, either in person at our building or virtually, with a group of elected officials and senior management in suits and ties, is a very challenging ask for a lot of people. And I mean, particularly in my district, if you look at the attendees and comments that have been provided in the past, I think it's no secret to anyone that a serious number of them, or a significant number of them, come from the same people repeatedly every month. But there is a huge portion of all of the people that we collectively represent who never provide any input in any way whatsoever. And
Eric, let me just interject 1 second. Help me understand something. So I hear an assumption in what you're saying that the only forums that exist for OPPD are your board meetings.
I guess in listening to what you were saying about input collectively to the board and senior management together, that is, I mean, other than surveys or other things like that, I think that is the primary method of input to us collectively, where we could all have the same understanding of the input we've received.
So Eric, again, just a question to you. Help me understand, in your tenure on the board, has OPPD ever had a special forum of stakeholders with SMT and board members present to discuss a particular topic? whether it be, an energy related topic or another topic?
Yes, that has been done, and this is a this is a strange time to have that discussion based on the transition into virtual versions, where there was a series of those planned. I guess as far as stakeholder input, I mentioned earlier, I am very interested in input prior to, as a board member, being asked to make a decision. And quite a bit of the input has been after the only time where the board would make a decision on an important topic. And so,
okay, I get that, but again, I'm asking you to kind of imagine maybe not how it is today, but how it could be, which is that prior to a decision being made by the board, there are organized forums in which, not at a board meeting, but in a special meeting, focused meeting on a given topic, you're inviting stakeholders and different perspectives in to discuss it, have both board members and SMT members present, have perhaps a variety of viewpoints there to help inform you, all prior to the board making any decisions on a given topic.
Yeah, I would absolutely appreciate that, and I would appreciate a collaborative effort by board and management and staff to see that accomplished.
Cool. That's really at the heart of what we're recommending here, is a process like that. Let's see. So Craig, you're up next, and then let's see if anybody else is up.
Yep. I think it's an interesting idea, and the more that we can find ways to productively and meaningfully engage customer owners, the better. And I could envision a variety of different ways in which something like this could work. The reality historically has been, some of us have been doing town halls, and it's an open invitation for other board members, but it's that one board member hosting it, so it's really kind of theirs to handle.
Correct.
I think my concern is, and this is not a showstopper, but my concern is that the amount of outreach that the utility writ large is already doing is extraordinarily high, far higher than it's ever been, and the trajectory is up for more and more and more. So that's my only hesitation, is I want to make sure that what we're asking of our customer owners when it's time for them to interject and spend their valuable time to provide us input and feedback, that it's at the right time and the right venue at the right moment with the right people present. Because we're asking a lot of them, and there's a lot going on, and I think it's fair to say the board right now has a high priority on public engagement. So we shouldn't shy away from it, but it's got to be threaded together really nicely.
Right. So Timothy, your hand is up.
Yeah, I think one would be to Director Williams' comment. Here's my concern from the CEO perspective. When we go out and do a broad stakeholder senior management stakeholder process, it has to be of a relatively large magnitude. I'm gonna do the extremes here just to make a point. I don't think when we're buying a rotor replacement package at one of our power stations that we necessarily need to do, and I don't think anybody's suggesting that need to do a stakeholder process. When we made some changes in our rates in 2015 or 16, we did do a broad stakeholder process. We did deep research demographically, focus groups. We did a lot of those kinds of things, and we continue to do those on certain items. The solar software and practice that we do, we went out to the solar industry to get feedback, perspective, insight around what that may look like. Our community solar, we did focus groups and did that. Now, we didn't necessarily invite the board to those focus groups. It's kind of a unique deal where you wouldn't do that. Large transmission projects where we're doing right-of-way, open to the public, board's more than welcome. Matter of fact, Director Moody has showed up at those, Director McGuire, Director Yoder has showed up at those. Others may have showed up to those as well, just because they're representatives and we're doing transmission in their district. It has to be something of relative significance. Otherwise, we will just wear out our stakeholder, the stakeholder value process. So,
Tim, help me understand from your perspective. Let's assume it is a significant, momentous decision for OPPD. do you see value in, what would be the value to you in doing it kind of more like a, and again, it could be in combination with these other kinds of instruments you're talking about, but having one or more stakeholder forums where, yes, the board is convened and the board is there. Yes, the SMT is there. So everybody is hearing and able to discuss and ask questions of the panel or the people who are speaking on a given topic.
And the preface of the question is,
The preface
what
is,
are my thoughts?
what are your thoughts? Do you see value in doing, do you see, if it's a momentous decision, do you see how that could be of value?
If it's a moment, yeah, sure. I mean, I don't disagree with that. Although I would say it has to be, and I think where everyone's landing on is this power with purpose, to be very honest with you, Bill and Eric. So what happens is we begin to narrow down on a very clear capacity solution that board members don't and didn't necessarily like the process we went through to really narrow down those solutions and those options. And so the feel was, hey, we need to reach this out to the public to get feedback input around it. And we got feedback, but the feedback wasn't to the solution. And what we were trying to do is to say, listen, there are only a couple solution items, a couple options to this solution. Mm-hmm. And I think what happens is you're getting the overflow from this very specific issue, that fair or unfair, as we began to share with the board, we looked at 70 million options down to a couple solutions that we engaged to. And I know this today isn't meant to do that, but this is the overflow you're getting. Well, and so yeah.
If I could interject just for 1 second, it is partly that, but it's also, and again, the ground rule is we're not going to relive that past.
Yep.
It's not just that. We heard board members say there are going to be issues that come forth before us in the future, and we need to figure out how we are effective as the representatives of our customers and what kind of stakeholder processes we can be engaged in as a board rather than as individual board members. And so our recommendation really goes to the heart of trying to help you figure out going forward, is there an option, is there a play in your playbook that says, okay, this is significant enough that we ought to create some of these forms that we've described. So that's really the purpose of this discussion.
Yeah,
look ahead
and
say, that's a play we need to have.
I don't disagree with that, and I think in many cases it is when the solutions really are driven by customer perspectives and insights. And I think we've done that. We have done that historically, to be very honest with you. Mm-hmm. And so I don't have a problem doing that. I think it's the right way to do it. Whether it's a organized forum, we do it. At least historically, we've done it in a more educational perspective with customers, and then allow them to give us feedback that we collect and then share with the board. Now that's how we've historically done it. I'm certainly open to the concept when we talk about our decarbonization strategic initiative, and our customer engagement. We are going to be going out to the customers to getting that feedback and input. And if we are able to open up in a public forum and allow people to actually get together, then the answer is yeah, we would like the board to be there and to hear and to be part of that kind of discussion and dialogue. Not opposed to that at all.
Well, I see a couple of hands, and then I really do want to make sure we get a break in here. So Janice, I know your hand is up. Ann, your hand is up. Tim, I don't know if that's a stale hand from before, but maybe you could take your hand down if it is. And Eric,
working on it here.
So I think with Janice and Ann, and Janice, why don't we start with you and then Ann?
Oh, earlier this spring, before COVID hit, Tim started a series of presentation with the state of the utility. And I think the format of that, where the meetings that I went to was just him, and then we did some virtually, was basically, it was a standard presentation, but it was available to groups, and he came to my chamber group and Rotary and talked about that. But to have those kinds of forums throughout the district, where management is represented and the board members are invited when it's in their subdivision. And I think that format was really helpful. And I thought that the groups that I'm in specifically were appreciative of Tim's time and his efforts to keep them informed about what's going on in the utility. And You know, it wouldn't have to be every year or every, but certainly whenever there's a big initiative going on, it's helpful to have those kinds of forums where board members are able to go and listen first and to hear firsthand what people are having, and not just having management come back to us and give us a synopsis. So that to me is a format I think that we could replicate going forward, where it seemed to work before the pandemic hit.
And I hear you, Janice, and I think that's definitely a play you have to have in your playbook too, is the individual district by district outreach with a board member representing that district, present with their colleagues being invited. We're suggesting a slightly different play in your playbook too, which is one in which everybody's convened, potentially with key advocates, key experts, so that the public can hear that, you can hear that, and the board can hear that, all together with a dialogue that then happens in order to kind of lift and sort of broaden, and as one of my colleagues says, complicate the thinking, so that we're not just hearing one particular perspective all the time, but hearing a lot of perspectives and appreciating the balance of perspectives. Anne, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I really agree with what you, I think it's.
I'm sorry, Anne, you broke up there. You really agree with, and I didn't hear the rest.
Yeah, I think, can you get me again? Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay. I agree with what you're saying as far as having a large forum to discuss, to bring just more than one type of stakeholder there at one time. At the same time, I think the problem is more now that we've sub-districted and people feel like they need to hear what their districts say. So that's why I think a couple of the board members went out and had, their networking town hall meetings. I think the problem with it is that they didn't have management there at the same time. And I think if they were going to do that, they needed management there too, as far as a sense of trust, and also management to hear, because management is the one who needs to also hear this information. But I think there's a little bit of a thing now that we have the more of a political subdivision on how to deal with your own constituents. And I don't know if Eric or Craig can add to that, but I think maybe the answer to that is, if you are going to have to do that, first of all, make sure it's a big decision that has to be made, and maybe bring in more people and advertise better and everything, that more than just one type of stakeholder is there.
Yep.
And have management there.
So I do know that we need to take a break, and Rick, I see your hand up. Can you make a brief comment, Rick, and then we can move to no, okay. Okay. Should we have a break first, Rick, and then come back to you?
Yeah. Remind me again the question we're trying to answer.
The problem we're trying to solve, I think, is this. When we did our interviews and when we look at the experience of other boards, we're seeing a couple of trends. When we did our interviews with you, we saw a trend toward and a push toward individual board members really wanting to go out and hear the voices of particular stakeholders, and being concerned about the fact that they didn't feel support from management in doing that. At the same time, we heard a trend amongst all board members in wanting to make sure that all board members were informed about what board members individually were hearing from different stakeholders. We couple that with the fact that our experience is across lots of public utilities, Rick, more activist board members and more advocacy groups are active in trying to influence the direction of the utilities. And so this is not a small problem to solve. It's a big problem to solve in terms of how do you effectively as a board act as the representatives of your customer owners, and how do you effectively as a board together in that collaborative spirit that Bill talked about, operationalize that. So the question to you is, as we've suggested, kind of one means to operationalize this is these larger forums. Do you agree with that? Do you think there's merit in that? And then more perhaps long term, we're urging you to think about adding to your work plan, how are we going to operationalize this? How are we going to really make real this role that we have to play? Does that help?
Does help. During
Okay, great. Okay, well, so Craig, we're going to cogitate during the break and also do other things, I'm sure. So I make it to be 5 of the hour. Should we try to come back at 10 after the hour and resume at that point? So it would be a 15-minute break. I see thumbs up. So we'll take a 15-minute break and we'll resume at 10 after the hour. Thank you very much.
Hi, Eric. I'll pass the ball back to you after our break concludes.
Okay, thanks, Mo.
Did we say 5 after or 10 after? I don't remember.
I said 10 after, Craig.
Okay. All right.
Getting close. I think we want to leave at least 10 minutes for kind of final reflections and a wrap up at the end of this. So when we get to 10 minutes of the hour, let's make sure we do that.
Okay.
So I have 3:09. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and pass the presentation ball back to you, Eric.
Okay, thank you, Mo.
Okay, I showed 210. Greg, are we ready?
Yep, let's do it.
All right. Okay. So now we're going to move to recommendations 4, 5, and 6. So number 4 is to clarify the board's process for deciding whether to consider revising a given policy. Number 5 is to clarify the purpose of the board's work plan and what information should contain, how often it should be reviewed, and how it's reviewed. And then number 6 is clarify how the board and CEO monitor compliance with GP and BL policies. So first of all, clarifying the process for deciding whether to consider revising a given policy. And at the previous workshop, it's my understanding it was agreed that the monitoring process was to be kept separate from the process of deciding whether to revise a given policy. Mm-hmm. So, acknowledge that the current work plan contains the monitoring schedule. Our recommendation is to make the work plan review process the key to doing this consistently. So we want to clarify the purpose of the board's work plan and what information it should contain. So Eric, if you would share that example that we've developed, those 3 separate sets of information.
Mm-hmm. Bill, do you want me to just go quickly through this and just kind of explain how it works?
Yep.
So this work plan has 4 tabs: board work plan priorities, a calendar preview, a parking lot, and then a status of training requests and ad hocs. Can everybody see this? Yeah, okay. So the board work plan priorities, this is really the heart of the work plan. This is where you list as a board those things that you as a board have agreed you want to work on in the coming year or future months. So we've just listed some things here: SD7, environmental leadership; SD9, resource planning. We've also included here that you've agreed, and this again is This is just made up stuff, right? So this is just examples of what could be here. You want to have an expert panel on future renewable scenarios. You want to have an expert panel on low income rates or a stakeholder panel on low income rates. So again, these are the things that you will agree as a board that you want to have. Now, this is not necessarily through a board vote, as Bill will tell you. It's just you've agreed by consensus or head nods that these are the things that are beyond the level of an individual board member request. So the next tab shows, okay, here's an example from SMUD. Here's how all of those things flow into the calendar. I think you guys have this. It shows the committee dates. It shows the board meeting dates. It shows the topics. It shows the presenters, et cetera. So that's, I think, standard operating procedure already for OPPD. The parking lot, it contains individual board member ideas about what things you individually want to talk about. Here's somebody named Slayton wanting to talk about the Cal ISO. Here's somebody else wanting to talk about the rooftop solar, have a rooftop solar expert panel. So again, these things are still sitting here. They're not in the work plan yet. They're on the parking lot. And then this last tab is just what's the status of ad hoc. SMUD uses a lot of ad hocs, which are just small committees to draft policies. So this is showing one was drafting corporate responsibility, BL, one was doing a BL around diversity and inclusion. And here are some training requests that board members had. So Bill, that's the overview of how this works.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So what we're suggesting is that from time to time, it could be quarterly, you'll have to decide on the timing, the board chair would facilitate a discussion about the work plan. So at SMUD, that would appear I think every month or every 2 months on
every month
a committee calendar. And so the board chair would facilitate the discussion, reminding everybody of the approved priorities on the work plan, the committee and board meeting preview, and the parking lot. And I want to emphasize that parking lot part because, board members, you're taking your expertise, what you've learned, your experience, and you're bringing it to your board position. So you've got thoughts and ideas and things that you think would be of value to the utility, and we don't want to lose those. So that's where the parking lot maintains them. But if there's not really a consensus to spend time and effort working on them, then they won't go any further than the parking lot, but they don't get lost, and that's the important thing. So changes to that work plan should really be by consensus, could be by vote. Normally it's by head nods, et cetera. But those discussions need to take into account the impact on time and resources. So at SMUD, for example, the CEO or other members of the senior team would weigh in on an issue, saying, "Gee, from our perspective, that we could do that by April." So it was a back and forth to arrive at changes or conclusions on the work plan, but it was a live meeting, and really, but importantly, the chair runs that discussion.
Mm-hmm. So Bill, let me just jump in here because I think there's a number of points here we want to discuss today. And Craig, I wanted to start with you if I can, because earlier today you said, we think we're pretty clear on how we, what our process is for revising a given policy. So from our interviews, we picked up that maybe the process isn't so clear. And so I just want to help us understand from your perspective, would using a work plan format like this, where you're clearly distinguishing between the parking lot and the board's work plan priorities, the identified work plan priorities, would this, and then having you, say, as chair, facilitate a regular discussion about what things go where, do you think that would help clarify this process of how do we decide to revise or address or create a new policy?
Well, I don't know how it would hurt. Yeah. I can't say that I have a perfect line of sight into where the confusion might be or the miscommunication might be. So, like repeating information in perhaps different formats in different ways over and over again is always going to clarify processes, right? So I don't know how it would hurt. For me, it's a question: is the juice worth the squeeze? Is the time spent monthly or quarterly going through, given that our board meetings are already 8 to 9 hours long, I want to make sure that every minute that we're spending and everything that we're deciding to do is done with very deliberate intention.
Yeah. So Rick, I think you have a stale hand up there. So if you wouldn't mind lowering your hand for me, if you want to raise it again, that's fine. But I do want to turn to you, Eric, just real quickly, because you were the one who earlier was saying we need to make sure we're clear on how we take an idea of something we want and translate it into a strategic directive or translate it into something that we, the board, have expressed. And so we heard that from you during our interviews. We heard it again today. So I'm curious from your perspective whether you think a format like this work plan would help to bridge that gap between kind of what the current process is and kind of where it could be a more clear process, a clearer process.
Yeah, I do think this would be helpful. And I guess I have 2 points. One, to your question now, I do think this would be helpful. And I do like the idea that there is a method by which input from the board, coordinated by the chair with senior management, this can be updated as necessary. I do think that would be, I think that would help us to highlight where we're going. And I agree with Craig that we want to be careful that we're not jumping from one foot to the other continually, but that as we look out, 1, 2, 3, 4 months in the future, if we know where things are and we can be responsive as necessary, I think that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And my second point was kind of from what I had mentioned earlier. Rather than an SD update, the specific example I was thinking of how a committee can, or how the desired updates are communicated by the board was more related to a rate. And I guess I'm curious if you think that is involved here, or how that other, I mean, that falls more under the regulator title of director. So rather than operational. So if you could address how that might be covered, because there is a specific example of rate updates that we've discussed, and in communicating from the board what type of a thing might be desired, how should that be incorporated here as well?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I might jump in, Eric, for a moment on that, because I assume at OPPD is similar to SMUD. When you're doing rates, that's a regulatory function, and there's a very defined process. There's timing that has to happen, and it goes across a calendar. It takes months before the final vote is done to change rates. So that shows up in the work plan. And because it shows up in the work plan, and by the way, there are other things that are state mandated reports or budgets that management makes sure is in that work plan as well. So it's the lead up to those. It's seeing out in the future and saying, well, if we're going to have a rate case that's going to be made, then 2 months, 3 months, 4 months before that, here's what we think we would like to see. And so that's how you use that work plan as a live document. Now, there are months where that discussion might be 2 minutes because there's nothing really changing. Other times it may be a more involved discussion, but it's not the topical discussion, it's just the scheduling discussion.
Mm-hmm. Eric, does that address your question?
Yeah, I think it does. And as you said, we are working on kind of a more formalized process of cycles for rate updating, which I don't know if we'll get to later today or tomorrow. But that was a specific item of what type of update would we like to see in the future? And there were some different directions we could go. And so how would for example, the finance committee express what work might need to be done in order to get to a recommendation that would end with a vote by the board? And that was kind of the question, because that's not, I mean, you don't need to take a vote in order to ask for some work to be done to develop something that you will vote on. But how can that be conveyed in some other method? And if expected future rate updates were also kind of a discussion topic that could be prioritized through this, I think that would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is one question, is just kind of the use of this format, this more specific format for your work plan. And then of course, the related question is the frequency with which you want to address it. So I haven't heard for a while I haven't heard from Tim Gay at all today. So Tim, if you're within the sound of my voice, do you have a thought about kind of this work plan process and how this might enhance the future work of the board?
Yeah, no, I think we have a work plan already laid out, so I like it. We have the work plans laid out. Could they be presented to us and reminded us a little bit more? I think that's helpful, because most people don't go through there, but I think OPPD has a pretty laid out work plan. If you want to amend it though, I joined later to your last question. I don't want to go backwards, but the idea is you need to work with the other board members and get that consensus before you can move anything forward. And sometimes that's tough to do in this COVID time, but I love the work and I think we do it. So
Amanda, if you've been tracking this, I'm just curious if you have thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think that this is actually something that came up when you and I and Bill spoke before the committee meeting, because I am not familiar with the work plan. I guess why am I not familiar with the work plan? So this, what I think I've seen, and maybe this is what's being considered the work plan, is basically just the calendar of when we're going to be doing different monitoring reports. Is that the work plan?
That's
yes,
part
that's
of it.
what I was.
That's
what
part
I
of
was
it.
referring.
But that's not
But we
all
know
of it.
what.
So if you here, for example, in the way that the SMUD does it, you can see that there's a monitoring of there's a monitoring report for ST11 and ST16. So that's part of the look ahead.
So I think my concern is that when I'm looking at ours, I'm only ever seeing the monitoring report. I'm seeing, you know, the lead up to the approval of the operating plan. If we know that there's going to be some big purchases, maybe that's in there as well to approve those things. But to me, there's never, like, I haven't seen on this work plan, like, when we're going to do rate work. When are we going to, if we come out of this retreat and say, okay, we need to revise these, you know, 3 policies, when that lead up work happens. Like, I guess I'm just not connecting the dots on those kinds of work items with the work plan.
Yeah, Scott, could you talk about the committee kind of accountability that we have in each committee, that the as we step through those committee accountabilities and where we review and then provide a report on each of the committees' kind of workarounds?
Yes, I think if I have your question right, Tim, and please redirect me if I, for some reason, I'm missing the point. I guess what I want to do is speak through the work plan. The conversation that you're talking about, Amanda, or that you're referencing, really, I believe, is a perspective of management's work plan that we know, based upon what Tim is talking about, which is the identification of the work of the committees, being it a monitoring report, or being it that we know we need to come forward with a corporate operating review at a particular point in time. So management develops a work plan. I think the distinction to be made between what is being proposed here and what we provide out for review and feedback is, where is it that we're capturing feedback directly from the board in terms of the work that the board feels that it needs to do?
Correct.
Because I don't feel that this is, I feel that we're coming to you and saying, hey, here's the work that we see of the organization that needs to be done. And we share that with you. Where are we gathering that feedback from you? So for example, one of the things that I could see being added as a result of this retreat is that there's an awareness or an agreement based upon priorities, that priority review of policies, you know, SD, X, Y, and Z, or BL, you know, ABC, whatever gets added to this list because the board has said this is our work priority. And then throughout the course of the year, if an individual director had an idea that they wanted something added to this policy, this would be the vehicle through which to bring it back to the full board, to have a discussion, to go, oh, let's add it to the work plan, or if we're going to add it to the work plan, what comes off the work plan? Because there's a lot of stuff on this work plan.
Right.
And it becomes the board's list that really could be integrated or nested within management, but it's reflective of what the board is talking about. And that is a piece that seems to be missing when you think about policy governance and what policy governance prescribes, that there is this board work plan.
Right.
Is that clarifying, Amanda?
It is, and I think that gets absolutely directly to my point, that that there's not really items identified in a work plan of when the board is going to be doing their work, I guess. So yes, I think that should definitely be an outcome of this retreat.
So for example, Scott, if I could just jump in. So in this example on the screen, ST7 environmental leadership was identified by the board as a priority to look at. It was done on November 19th, and then an ad hoc was formed to look at ST7 and ST9, and that ad hoc is met twice, Amanda. And that signifies that the work has begun, and this is how the work is progressing, and at the regular updating of this work plan, you would hear kind of, when do we expect to hear from the ad hoc on bringing a draft policy back to the board? One of the things we heard through the interviews is the board struggles with understanding how to be a leader in formulating policy. And so we're suggesting that this is the way to do that, is to be clear on, again, the distinction between individual board members' ideas that go in the parking lot, and then agreed upon items that you're going to commit resources and time to investigate and explore. There is going to be a need to consult with Tim and senior management on this, because the implication is that when you look at these work plan priorities, there is going to be some staff time required. And so I think there is that teamwork that Bill has alluded to several times today, that you need to have a collaboration with your senior management around how many resources do we have available to staff this amount on the work plan.
And if I may add, I think to get something added to this work plan requires a discussion amongst the board, which really serves to reinforce unity of control.
Exactly.
And also, to the point of discussion with management, it allows for that initial discussion around prioritization, and yes, existing capacity would allow us to absorb this particular task or discussion, or if this is a priority, an opportunity to push back in an informed way around current constraints that would allow us to prioritize the work better and more effectively. It should empower really Tim in an informed way to be able to see that and to manage through it, because we can see everything that's being asked for.
Mm-hmm. So I see two hands up. I see Ann, you have your hand up, and Craig, your hand is up as well. Ann, could you go ahead, please?
Yeah, I think this is really a great idea as far as giving the board the sense of more control that they are actually governing in addition to the policies. My question looking forward would be would this be the time during a retreat that we perhaps prioritize a work plan for the year? Because I think we have to have everybody together. So I think as far as implementation, so hopefully, which is your idea, that at the end of this, we're going to have sort of formulate a work plan for the year.
Certainly it's my hope that by the end of tomorrow, you will have an agreed upon set of things that go on this list.
Right.
And you will have, if you agree to the format, we can actually do that work tomorrow as a way of helping you then be clear about the work you want to do going forward. And as Bill mentioned earlier, then also you can layer in the other things that have to happen as a regular course of work.
And I'm not sure that I was fully complete in answering the question, Tim, that you had asked earlier with regards to committees. Also within the charters that the committees have, there's work that's outlined. And so really on an annual basis, the committee has an opportunity, I believe, to go through those specific charters and understand, and then bring back to the board and say, this is kind of the work that we also see of the committee. And then at the end of the year, the committee further then does an assessment as to whether or not they achieved the work that was outlined by the committee.
So one could even imagine adding a tab
There's
here.
a couple of points where throughout the year you're kind of influencing and providing input into the work plan. Tim, did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely, Scott. So
thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Let me go
that's
back
the
to
charter.
Ann, because she had, I think she had a question there.
I'm adding on to Scott's comment about the committee. At the end of the year, the committee gives a report, but usually it's just that a publish is not discussed. So the question is whether or not how to communicate that more effectively as far as work plan, because we've got it there. I just think we need to step one more step forward as far as communicating that with the entire board and what that committee's idea is for work plans for the next year. So it might be 2 times that we do this, both at the retreat in the summer and then in January or whatever, after those committee report to make that more formalized, because right now those committee reports really aren't that formalized as far as discussion amongst the board.
Exactly, because this would provide the board an opportunity to discuss all of it and understand what all of it is. I think the other thing is that sometimes, like, there's been a general discussion that this annual retreat would result in the identification of priorities around SDs or other policies to work. But sometimes through the course of the year, how are you going to tee up a policy if in August it wasn't identified as a priority, but it becomes one throughout the year?
Exactly.
And this work plan would allow that discussion to take place. I'm thinking about adding, and then there's a general discussion, and then the determination will be made as to whether or not to add it, but not wondering if it should be added or having any lack of clarity or too much ambiguity that just creates some level of discomfort that we're never going to discuss it, or how do you bring that up?
Craig, I know your hand was up.
Yeah, I'm just going to really echo some things that y'all just said, which is like that the reality is a lot of this planning happens at the committee level, and everyone else that's not on that committee doesn't have an understanding for status. Where are we? And the number of times, we've fielded that question, hey, I'm on this committee. Whatever happened with this in PI? I haven't heard anything lately. So this would be the way to sort of keep everyone abreast of what's going on, where it's at. And today, right now, quite honestly, I think the chairs of those committees do a really good job of communicating out and not losing sight of those things. I think they're organized. They've got their own little work plan. Mo does a great job of making sure things don't get missed, but this is a really good, like, we have so many engineers in this company. A good project management tool, that's in many ways sort of what we're talking about here, so that we know what's the task, who owns it, what's the deadline, what's the status. So I think it to the extent that we create something that's clear, easily understandable, doesn't create unnecessary burdens of management to monitor and keep track of, then I think it's a really, really good idea. It's got to be dynamic though. It can't just be once a year we get it done and then it's gonna sail, because things change too fast.
Yep.
So we have a mechanism by which to update it on the fly as we go.
Yeah, and I would suggest that it also be that you consider that it's a rolling document. It's not a document that ends in December. You may have board terms that end in December. I don't know what your election cycle is, but the board goes on. So you may want to consider that as well.
So I'm hearing broad consensus that the idea of re-engineering this work plan and perhaps using a format similar to the one that we're presenting would be a useful refinement on your work processes. I'm also hearing that you recognize the importance of the chair facilitating discussion regularly, at least around the board's portion of this work plan. And I'm also hearing the importance of adding to this work plan a committee tab, a committee status tab, so that the work plans of the committees can be tracked as well. Other people have thoughts or comments on this? Mike Cavanaugh, I haven't heard from you for a while. Thoughts about this as you listen to the conversation?
Nothing really, other than, I don't know if it's be relevant or not, but I'm a strong advocate of strong committees. Put the burden on the committees and the chair to have these proposals moved on. I think sometimes the committee can possibly have a stronger influence on what we do.
Say that last sentence one more time, Mike. You broke up a little bit.
I said sometimes I think we don't put enough emphasis. I don't want to say emphasis on the committees to have the authority to move things through the process.
So does anybody not feel that there's value in continuing down this path of trying to do the things I just talked about? Tim, does this feel like the right move to you in terms of trying to create more of this clarity?
Yes, I do. I think there's a way to do that. And for us, it's to take 2 or 3 different documents and kind of lay them in, I think, which would be valuable. I think the work that's going on strategic initiative and some of the timing and plans that we have, I think it'd be good to lay in that work plan so the board gets to see that over the next 12 months. You know, because we'll get questions, hey, when are we going to see the update on X? And hey, it's coming in 2 months. But we got to remain flexible, because sometimes it's not 2 months, maybe it's a month, maybe it's 3 months, because we haven't done significant work, or it could be a very quick update, which is, hey, we're still doing work. We plan on moving, you know, the deep dive out a month or 30 days or whatever that may be. So I think it's something that we can kind of work through. Yeah.
Cool. So there is one more recommendation that I want to just briefly touch on before we go on to next steps and summarizing what we've done and previewing tomorrow. And that's our recommendation number 6, which is to clarify how the board and CEO monitor compliance with the board's GP and BL policies. So as you know, you took a survey, and you'll see the results, or probably have already seen the results of that survey with regard to the GPs and BLs. That's certainly one good way in which we've seen other boards monitor the compliance with the GPs and BLs. Some boards we work with also actually schedule committee time to talk about the GPs, or a specific GP or a set of GPs, especially those where they feel that there's a need to more regularly look at them. So I just wanted to open it up just sort of briefly to a discussion of, are we happy with the idea of doing an annual survey of the GPs and BLs altogether? Is there some other process in addition to that, or instead of that, that we would like to see in terms of monitoring compliance and the quality of our GPs and BLs? Who has a thought about that? Craig, I see I have a hand up. I'm not sure if that's a stale hand or a real hand. Who has a thought with regard to that? And can I call on you, just because I know you've been with us from the very beginning of this whole process, and I think you may sort of get the importance of regularly reminding the board members of kind of what the GPs and BLs say, as kind of the way in which you can routinely refresh your understanding of the board's role, the delegations, all the things we talked about earlier today.
I think that looking forward, I think it's very, very important to look at the GPBLs. The past year, with new people coming on, people have been really, really focused on SDs and not really figuring out the GPGLs at the same time. Because if you don't have the BLs and GPs in coordination with those SDs, things aren't going to work. You're going to have a lack of trust. And I think if we don't have a good understanding of that, we do develop a lack of trust, which I think, you know, is one of the problems. I think this is one way that we should, you know, every year we did this review, but there should be a discussion on that too, and how we can improve it, which we've done. We should continue to do.
Craig, what's your view on this, on the question of kind of how often or how to look at the GPs and BLs?
Well, as many people may know, I started the year by incorporating a read-along BL or GP reminder at the beginning of the committee meetings, and that was just, you know, my way of sort of trying to elevate them in priority and make sure that we all understood them. With COVID, we set that aside. But I think it's important. I mean, I think the to Ian's point, SDs we paid a lot of attention to, and rightly so. But the extent to which we have a common understanding and interpretation and knowledge of the BLs and GPs, I think that's really important. I think the challenge is the mechanism by which you do that. Given all that we have going on, that's my kind of constant challenge, is figuring out where to weigh that in terms of priority. But it's important. It's certainly important. And if there are some that perhaps we're not following in the way that we should, those are ones that should certainly, you know, we should find them under our nose more frequently than they are today.
Before we move on to kind of, go ahead, Janice.
So yeah, I think this would, you know, this is, it's good to have that reminder. I mean, we talk a lot about the SDs because that's what the board is telling management, senior management, that we want them to do, and kind of not looking at our own, not really scrutinizing our own mandates. But also making sure that as as the industry evolves, as the expectations of our customer owners change, that we really look at these and make sure we're wearing all three of those hats appropriately, and that we're doing the duty that we need to have in wearing all of those three hats and incorporating those three roles and balancing them in our work on the board. So yeah, I think that it's good to have the BLs and GPs as part of this discussion. Probably, I don't know that we need to have another separate process for this, but making sure that those BLs and GPs are at least reviewed annually and stressed. The importance of those are stressed. So can I go back to the slide that you still have up for
Sure, of course.
for that? So I think that this is really important that we have that work plan. Some of the frustration or some of the concern that I know I have had and a couple of the other board members is that last year at this retreat, we identified SD9 as a priority. And what's happened in committee is when it's been brought up, there's been pushback from some members of senior management who either think we don't need it at all or who think that it's, not necessary or can't figure out how to get it changed. And so I think making sure that we have this work plan and that those are followed up and that really the board is directing those senior management to that. And I get that there were a lot of other competing priorities besides SD9 and but that we did have something on the work plan that really didn't come to fruition over the last year. And there were a lot of reasons for that. And I get that. But, making sure that the board has some consensus on that.
Yeah.
That's all.
To your point, Janice, one thing that we haven't alluded to, and you can see it in the way in which it's formulated here on the slide in front of you, is you do have this play you could make of forming an ad hoc. So right now it feels like what OPPD has in the way of arrows in its quiver when it wants to formulate a new policy is you can refer it to a committee. You can refer it to Tim and to the staff, but you don't really have a way of initiating a policy on your own. You don't really have a mechanism for that. And so the ad hoc, which is a small group of board members coupled with a senior management team person or two, can get together and really be charged with drafting policy language to bring back to a committee for discussion. It creates another way, another avenue for you to be the initiators of policy. And I think Bill and I would recommend that you think about that as an additional mode of action.
Yeah, I'd have to say that in my experience at SMUD, probably one of the most powerful things we had in our toolbox was the ability to do ad hocs, which would be appointed by the chair, the board chair, and would be for a specific purpose and would not go on forever. And it would not just be necessarily management in a subset of board members. It might also be subject matter experts within staff who would bring that specific expertise to try to do that drafting. So you don't draft by full committee, and it just makes it easier to come with something that's a straw proposal back to committee. Just made everything work more efficiently.
So we are getting to a quarter of the hour and or almost 10 of the hour. And I do want to spend a little time just wrapping up and then having reflections before we adjourn today and move in tomorrow. So I think today we've heard pretty strongly that you like the idea of this revamped work plan, and we'll certainly help Scott and Tim et al. Figure out kind of the examples we have, and obviously Tim talked about layering in the reports that you already have. So I heard strongly an endorsement of that. I certainly heard a strong desire to figure out how to operationalize this role of the board in being a receptor for and a vehicle for hearing stakeholder feedback and really getting that clarity around how do we do that, not in replacement of your existing mechanisms, but as an additional tool when significant decisions are coming up that enables you to hear expert opinion, stakeholder opinion, all in one at one place. I also heard that you liked the idea of moving forward with looking at the language we introduced with regard to the communication expectations of the CEO, with regard to those circumstances in which the CEO would inform the board, that could be an additional plank within your delegations to the CEO. I heard some interest in considering our proposal to revise your unity of control policy with regard to informal and formal evaluations. I didn't hear a strong push to do that, so I would say that got a little bit of a weaker nod from you. Nonetheless, we'll certainly include it in our synopsis as something to think about. We certainly heard the agreement around continuing to at least annually look at your GP and BL policies, and so that was an area of clear consensus. Bill, did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I think we covered the base.
Okay. Craig, did I miss anything important? Anything else you'd want to add to the list I just went through?
No, I mean, I've been keeping a list of to-dos as well, and we're pretty well aligned on those.
So just previewing tomorrow's workshop. So since we have I think a reasonably well agreed upon process for identifying board identified work plan priorities, the goal tomorrow is to look at the SDs, the GPs, and the BLs that your board survey and our interviews, but primarily the board survey surfaced as being the most important ones to look at, to understand kind of why you want to look at them. Again, we're not trying to solve the problem tomorrow of here's how we would revise it, but just to understand why is it a priority for us to look at it and put it on the work plan, agree on the prioritization of those things that you want to work on. And yeah, that's really the table being set for tomorrow's workshop. It's going to begin with Scott. I think, Scott, you will be the one presenting the findings from the board survey. We'll do a brief recap of the things we heard through the interviews. We've already seen that there's tight alignment between both what we heard in the interviews and what's in the findings of your survey. And we want to end up someplace like on this screen tomorrow with an agreed upon work plan, a dynamic work plan, as I think Craig emphasized. So with that, reflections. It would be really great to hear from each board member and Tim, reflections on what we were trying to cover today, which is really kind of a refresher of what is policy governance all about, how does it work, what are the limits, what are the advantages in terms of how it can be effective as a way of governing. So would somebody like to go first, or shall I just start at the top of the list and perhaps ask Rick to go first?
Say me.
Yeah, I did. Well, you're on my list. You're at the very top of the toppermost. So
as it should be. Since you can't see me, I've been turned off.
I can't see you. Can you turn yourself back on?
Well, we'll try it. Mo turned me off because for some technical reason. We'll see if it works.
There you are.
Hello, possibly.
Hey, yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, cool. So, well done. It was a lot to cover in a little bit of time. I think I'm a little daunted by some of the work items. On others, I feel, other than I think there's a much smaller amount of effort. The one where I think we have the greatest work is that board stakeholder communication out of the things that we were talking about today. My struggle that I identified at the beginning, I think still exists, but I'm encouraged by the language I heard today more than once. Thank you, Bill, about this being a team effort. And I think, everybody honestly is trying. to make things better. So with that in mind, I think we made some good steps today, and look forward to, pretty excited really about the work plan elements that we'll hit tomorrow.
Cool. Anne?
I thought it was a very good day. It sort of, as I was writing down notes of things to do, it looks like there's a lot more to do than there was at the beginning of the day, which I think is progress. I think we have a lot of work to do still in policy governance and with our BLs and our GPs. I think we have to still look at that. And I said that before, and I'll say it again. I think for us, for the SDs to really work well together, we have to look at our governance policies and our BLs and to be aware of those. I am complete.
Thank you, Anne. Eric?
Yep, I would echo the work today on verifying the desire for the work plan, and then looking at items tomorrow to be included in the work plan. That's great. I did have one additional question. This isn't really what you had asked for, but there was something I had written down earlier as a question that might be relevant for tomorrow. We generally talk about the difference between what the outcomes that the board is responsible for and how the implementation that senior management and staff is responsible for. We didn't get very much into the detail of where the line might be between those two, and maybe this is a question that we'll talk about in policy updates tomorrow. But I'm very interested in how we draw that line of responsibility, and I don't think that it's specified in any of the policies right now, and maybe it's not supposed to be. But I guess I am interested in having some more discussion on what versus how, and where the distinction lies between that. And I hope that's something we can talk about as we look at the level of detail in the policy work that we might outline tomorrow and might carry out through that work plan during the year.
That's great. We'll be sure to touch on that, Eric. Thank you.
Great.
Janice?
Yeah, so let's go back to the very beginning when we talked, and I think it was Tim that talked about strengthening cohesion and trust. And that's kind of been pretty high on my radar and was one of my goals for my first year on the board. And I think that I'm looking forward to improving that relationship and trust between the board and management. And then also under unity of control, and helping me to understand, but not just management's point of view, but if they're doing public outreach, if they're doing surveys, if they're doing community engagement, bringing us the results of those surveys in a manner that's helpful to us for decision making. And I know that some of the teams at OPPD are working on more surveys and outreach and customer engagement, and having that information presented to us either before or at the time that we're being asked to make a decision helps us to understand what informed management's decision on whatever process or whatever item that the board is being asked to vote on. So bringing that full circle. Thank you.
You bet.
It was very helpful.
Tim Gay?
Yeah, well, thanks. Sorry to miss the earlier part, but just listening in, I think it's important to keep doing this, first of all, because there's obvious disconnect between the strategic directives and where everyone thinks we're going or what going. But it reminds me a little bit as I hear some people, why didn't we get to this? Why didn't we get to that yet in a short amount of time? But it's kind of like the old Mike Tyson, you have a plan until you get punched in the face. And with the COVID thing, I mean, we've been punched. So these things take time, and working as a team, you just need to build that cohesive, if we're using that term, group together and get the outcomes. I know it's like, well, why are we not studying this? Why are we not doing this? But I don't think we're specific enough of here's exactly what I want done. And I know you need experts to do that, but maybe we could be a little more No, just specific on here's what I want to accomplish in SD9. This is exactly what I'm looking for. I don't think that's ever said. So management is sitting there, well, we're doing this, but there's just not a specific goal. So that's my thoughts from what I've heard.
Thanks, Tim. Mike Kavanaugh?
I think things went well today. I look forward to tomorrow. One thing I want to bring up, in case I forget it, this is an issue that I spoke with Bill and Eric when we had the one-on-one or one-on-two, I guess you call it, discussion. I'm asking the other directors, I guess, to give this some thought. Would it help if we had, at our meetings, a hard copy of the SDs in front of us, each meeting for reference? There's something to think about. I thought it might be something that might be helpful at times.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I got.
Well, and parenthetically, that's something that recommend with our boards, Mike, just because it's hard to access them all easily, no matter how good your online tools are. Amanda?
I think Amanda had to leave early.
Amanda had to leave early. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I was going to turn to you, Craig, last after we heard from Tim. So, Tim Burke, thoughts?
Yeah, so I like the idea about the work plan because I appreciate Tim Gay's comment because, you know, if we don't get to things, it's because there's higher priority things and there may not be clarity on exactly what direction that we may be getting from the board, and it may not be from the board, it may be from individuals in the board. And so that's going to be really important for us, I think, is that work plan that we all agree to and understanding that there's pushes and pulls. So there's so much work that can be done. And if we push something forward, we're going to pull something back. We just need to understand what that is. And that's my job as the CEO to make sure that I reflect that. But I can assure you that if we don't get things done, it's because there's higher priority things that we're doing. And for the benefit of the full organization and for our customer owners. So I like the idea about the work plan. I like the idea about the communication. This will be interesting. You know, I think we'll kind of design this without kind of COVID-19 in mind, because I think that's probably the current kind of COVID scenario. So I think we'll think through what that may look like. And as I think Janice articulated, we planned on doing that in each of the districts around Power with Purpose, and to have that conversation in a very public stakeholder process forum that the board would certainly have the opportunity to engage in. That just didn't happen. And so to Tim's point, great strategy and until the first shot's fired, and here we are, we got to kind of make it up. And so we've done a lot of it virtually and online. So those are the two items to me that I think are really ahas for me today. And so I look forward to us flushing those out as we get going. So thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Tim. Craig, can you wrap us up and bring us home?
Yeah, so I'm not muted, am I? Nope. So again, I appreciate everyone's willingness to engage in this format. I know this is tricky, and I can't tell you how nice it would be to just be sitting across the table from all of you and reading your body language. So here we are, and that's the way that it goes. But nevertheless, I appreciate how you all have engaged and used the technology as best we could. I like a lot of the ideas that came out of this, and I think we refined them on the fly already today. So to me, I think there was an opportunity to really kind of step back a little bit, especially with respect to the work plan tool. That could be something that we could build to make us extraordinarily more efficient and effective, and actually save us time in the long run, which would be cool. And as I think about one of the things that I'm mindful of is every time a new idea is brought to the table, I have this reaction of that's one more thing to do. That's one more thing to do. But I think we really want to think about how we could just do things differently rather than not putting new things on top of things we're already doing. Yeah, I mean, y'all know I'm process driven, and a lot of today was about figuring out how we can make our processes better. So this is stuff that I geek out on, and I'm excited to take some of it and run with it. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we're right, well, a couple of minutes over, but not bad for bringing this ship home on time. So thank you all. Look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 1 o'clock your time. And have a great evening. Rick Yoder, I hope you cogitate effectively and bring us the benefit of all that good cogitation. Same to everybody else. We look forward to hearing your thoughts tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Be well.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Bye.